How's it going, Eliminators? Today I'm going to be showing you how to change the transmission oil on an ExMark Lazer Z zero turn riding lawnmower. So let's get right into it. So I have an ExMark Lazer Z riding lawnmower here, and I've already serviced this thing in regards to the engine and the deck. So I'll show you some pictures. I went underneath, scraped a whole bunch of grass out of this thing, and sharpened the blades, and then also installed a new blade because the center one wouldn't balance. So we ended up replacing one of those blades, and I didn't undercoat this deck because the steel on this deck is pretty thick. So this is a commercial model mower, and they're built to withstand a little bit of extra abuse. So like I told my customer, the deck is good to go, and I just scraped the grass out, and that'll just prevent it from getting wet and leaching some of that water into the metal. The engine has been serviced as well. This model of engine is a Kawasaki FH680V, and it has a brand new air filter. I've done the oil filter, changed the oil, and we've also installed two new BPR 4ES spark plugs on it. So the only thing I have left to do is service the transmission. This is a hydrostatic transmission because it is a zero turn. And right here is our transmission oil reservoir. So with the seat flipped up here, this is what we're after. Here is your main hydraulic assemblies. Now on some of the ExMark models, you're gonna have a brass nut that's either here and here, and you're gonna have to back those off to put your transmission into what's called a freewheel mode. On this model, however, you have these little levers here. So clockwise is to tighten them up to put it into drive, and counterclockwise is to put it into freewheel. And with this thing in freewheel and the parking brake off, it's super easy to push around. Now these relief levers here, they are going to play a role when we're filling this thing up with oil, so we'll come back to them. But right now what I'm going to do is just jack the rear end of this machine up so that we can get underneath of it a little bit easier. So just to show you guys where the oil filter is for the transmission, it is right there. So for the purpose of this video, I've just jacked up the right rear of this machine, but I'm going to be putting my oil pan down here, so I'm going to have to end up moving my jack, but I just wanted to come up under here. You guys can see that this oil filter is pretty damaged, so it has been hit a few times, probably going over a rocky or rough surface. So I'm going to get my jack out of here, put my oil pan down, and then I'm just simply going to remove the oil filter. And with my oil pan down there to catch all of the oil, we're just going to come up here and I'm going to open this cap up, and that'll just help the airflow go through so that it drains a little easier. Now that it's loose, I can come over here and unthread it. It's going to make a mess, so you're going to want some shop towels. So while you have the transmission oil draining, I'm just going to come to my reliefs here, and I'm just going to open them up approximately half to one turn. You don't want to go more than one turn, guys, and when you're retightening them, you definitely don't want to over tighten them. And it also says the same here on the little safety sticker: drive wheel release, one turn counterclockwise to release, do not over tighten. So by opening them, we're just going to let extra air out of the system so that there isn't any hydraulic fluid being trapped inside of the lines or the pump. So similar to how if you take a straw here and we put it into some water and I hold my thumb over the top of the straw, by lifting it up, it will lift the water, and by releasing my thumb off of the straw, it will release all of the water inside of that. So a hydraulic system is the same, guys. By allowing air to replace some of that fluid, it will help the fluid drain a little bit easier. Now the oil that ExMark recommends to run is a Mobil 15W50 synthetic. So this is a synthetic oil. It'll stand up to a little bit extra heat. So I'm going to take some of this oil here, and I'm going to fill up my filter. Now, because I use STENS products, I'm using a STENS 120-380. The OEM number is an ExMark 109-4180. Now, normally what I would do when I'm filling up or priming an oil filter is I would measure out the amount of oil that I wanted, and then I would subtract whatever I was putting into the oil filter from my totals. Now, on some of the ExMark models, they're going to have a cold and a hot, or a high and a low aluminum piece, and that's just going to be your marker, whereas on this one we just have this little metal bar that goes across the tank. So once we get our filter in, we're going to be filling this reservoir up to that little metal bar there. So believe it or not, I filled this oil filter here right to the top, guys, and what's going to happen is, because you have a paper filter in here, that paper filter is going to soak up some of that oil. So I'm just going to go ahead and wait a couple more minutes and let that filter really absorb the oil. Then I can go ahead and fill this up again, because when you're installing an oil filter from the bottom up, you don't spill any when you're putting it on versus, let's say, a John Deere riding lawnmower where the filter's sideways. As soon as you go to flip it, all that oil is going to come out. So at least this way we can really prime the oil filter, not only to the point where the paper filter absorbs all that oil, but to the point where the oil filter itself is actually filled with fluid. Now, before I go ahead and install this oil filter, I've taken a little bit of oil on my finger and run it around the rubber seal. That will just prevent it from chafing and tearing when we go to install this. Now, this oil here, it measures out to 1 liter in the container. So if I spin this around and have a look at exactly how much oil is left in the container, we can see it's just under the 800 milliliter mark. So that means there is exactly 200 milliliters of oil into that filter. They soak up quite a bit. And now that I have the filter installed, I'm just going to take my oil filter wrench and I'm just going to give it about a half of a turn just to snug it up in place so that I know there's not going to be any oil leaking. You really don't have to go much, guys. I'm just going to give it a slight little turn here, and that should be good, just until it's nice and snug. Now, once you have your oil filter installed, we're just simply going to go ahead and fill up our reservoir here. Keep going until you get to approximately that little bar or your marker where it says cold. So the number one enemy of any hydraulic system is air, guys. You don't want air in the lines. So similar to a power steering pump on a car, or let's say your brake lines on a car, the air is going to prevent the fluid from pushing the hydraulic motor, and on this it has 2 hydraulic motors that turn the wheels. So we're going to have to run this machine, and we're going to run this machine with the little bleeders open so that air is flowing. Now, it may sound a little rough at first, but that's going to be normal. That's just the air circulating out of the machine. You're going to have a whole bunch of bubbles up here in your reservoir. So right now you guys can see it's just smooth oil. There's a little bit of air bubbles in there just from me pouring the oil in, but essentially air always wants to come to the highest point. So what's going to happen is as you run your machine, we're going to get on the handles and go forward and back a couple times. And what's going to happen is all that air is going to circulate itself around into the reservoir. So all of the oil in this tank is going to be really foamy. And then what we're going to do is we're going to let it sit, let all the air bubbles escape, and then we're going to go ahead and top off the oil. And we're going to do that a few times. Now, something that I should also point out here, there's going to be a little air vent somewhere on your cap. So this one's here. You can either take a compressor or you can just blow into that and just make sure that air comes out from this side. And what that'll do is it will allow air to come into the system, and that will allow the fluid inside of the tank there to circulate through the system. So you don't want to have what's known as a vapor lock, which is just a clogged vent on your cap preventing any airflow from going in. And like I said, guys, as you run it, you're going to see more and more air coming into the system. So that's a whole lot of froth or foam at the top of that. And again, you know, this is a process, but you have to go over this process to ensure that your transmission has a long and healthy life. Because if something were to ever happen to these transmissions on these zero-turn mowers, boy, they can run just about as much as a replacement one if you were to buy one of these things used. So again, you don't want to be in that situation where you have to replace your transmission. So we're doing regular yearly annual maintenance, and we're going to prevent any harm from coming to this machine. This isn't really the hardest part of the job, it's just the most time consuming because you have to run your machine, go back, check the reservoir, let it sit, let those air bubbles dissipate, add some oil, go back and run it again. So it's a little bit of back and forth, but if you want to ensure that your equipment lasts a long time, then you better service that equipment regularly. Now, as you guys can see, this process is a pain in the butt. It's just a little repetitive, but you're going to get to a point where we're at now. So the air bubbles or the foam is dissipating, and we're getting more and more just full, clean, smooth oil in there. Then you guys can just add oil whenever it's needed just to keep that system topped up. Now, after a while, when you're running it with the valves cracked slightly open, you're going to get to the point where there might not be a lot of air bubbles coming into your reservoir. Now, at that point, what I do is I go ahead and I close those 2 valves and I get a good run in this thing. I do some circles, I go forwards and back, and then I stop and I open those valves up again, and then I repeat the process where I'm going forwards and backwards slowly, because you have to understand that when those valves are cracked open slightly, you're not going to have full use of your drive. So you're going to push that lever all the way forwards, and it's not going to take off like it normally would if those valves were closed. But it is important to have those valves open, because what that does is it allows that air to escape the system. So just like bleeding a brake line, this is kind of the same thing. And after a little bit of waiting and running this machine a bit more, we're at the point now where all of the air bubbles are out of the oil. So one last thing, you're gonna go down to your transmission relief valve there, and you're just gonna tighten them up. You don't wanna over tighten them, guys. You just wanna go to the point where they are snug. So this machine is now fully serviced and ready to be returned back to my customer. Now for this particular machine, I ended up using one and about just over half of this jug here. So you guys should be able to get away with just buying two, and then I'll give my customer this one here so that as he's using the machine, if he ever has to top it up on oil, then he can go ahead and do that. So that's how you change the transmission oil and filter on an ExMark Lazer Z 0-turn riding lawnmower. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week. Check the channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.